All right, welcome to this week's Ronin seminar. We've got Lucas Mix today, who is going to be talking to us about a population genetic theory of life. Take it away, Lucas.
All right. Well, it's great to be here. I am a big fan of the Ronin Institute. Let's see. I am what happens if you go to college for too long. So I have bachelor's degrees in biochemistry and comparative religion, a doctorate in evolutionary biology from Harvard, where I did theory with David Haig, which is how I know John. And then I went to seminary and became a priest in the Episcopal Church. I am very interested in the so-called big questions, one of which is how we define and understand life. And along those lines, I have been involved with the NASA astrobiology programs for the past scarily 22 years. So I am really particularly interested in this question of, if we're looking for life elsewhere, what exactly is it that we are looking for? And so I have gotten involved in this project. I am also very interested in sort of philosophy and theology of the theory of life. That's not what I'm focusing on today, but I am wrapping up a book on the history of definitions of life from Aristotle to Darwin. So I'm very interested in that question as well. I don't have that many slides, so please feel free to interrupt. And mostly I'm looking for feedback about which parts of this make sense and where we might go from here. So with that, a population genetic theory of life. We have this big question, what is life? Which I think can get a little bit beyond us on occasion because it's so broad and we use it in so many different ways. So I think perhaps the more reasonable scientific question is, what aspects of life are worth studying? What are those things that we associate with life that strike us as important and worthy of our time? And I wrote this paper for the journal Astrobiology in 2015. It's become sort of unpopular to try to define life. And I want to argue that we really should be defining life, not because life is a natural category, but because if we use a word, we should know what it means. We should know what we mean when we're using it. And so along these lines, I suggested 4 different types of, quote, life. And they're not the same as all of life. I'm not trying to shoehorn life into these boxes, but I think they're different boxes. And so it's worth having different names for the different concepts. So Woe's life is the word I use for everything that we have put on the tree of life. So biologists take small subunit rRNA usually, we've got some other molecules now, and try and create this tree that contains every living thing on it and how they're related to each other. And so I'm calling Woe's life this set of all things that have small subunit rRNA, and so we can compare phylogenetically in that way. Obviously, there would be other tree lives. So if you wanted to, say, make something based on basic metabolic proteins, that might be a good way of doing that. But this small subunit rRNA that was compared by Woes and his collaborator Fox, this would be one way of defining life. It's just the stuff we know. Second one, very common, Darwin life, things that exhibit evolution by natural selection. Probably the most popular definition of life going among the biology crowd these days, if we just think of things that evolve by natural selection. So you can say stars evolve, and people do that, and I think that's a perfectly valid use, but I'm really talking about specifically this idea of natural selection that's proposed by Darwin and comes sort of into its own in the middle of the 20th century. So those sorts of things would be Darwin life. Haldane life, after a fellow by the name of JBS Haldane, that is things that exhibit metabolism and maintenance. I'm not sure this is entirely a clear category, but it's very popular. We can think of things that regulate themselves. And that's probably the second most popular definition among biologists for a definition of life. Finally, Aristotle life, things that perpetuate their type by informing matter, that is, shaping physical stuff. I go back and forth on whether this is a good biological definition of life, but it is the most common definition of life, or traditionally it's called nutrition, or oddly enough, the possession of a vegetable soul. This is the most popular definition of life between about 500 BC and 1500, maybe even 1700. And so that's why that's up there. I'm not going to talk about Aristotle life today, but it's just sort of interesting. I think that's worth putting on our little grid. So, Woe's life, once again, cellular terrestrial life. Darwin life usually goes by the name of replicators or Darwinian individuals. Haldane life, regulators or physiological individuals, and Aristotle life. Now, one of the interesting things is that replicators and regulators do not line up the way that we would want them to. So I think many of us, our intuition is that Darwin life and Haldane life should just be different ways of describing roughly the same thing, but we find cases where replicators and regulators don't line up. So there's this idea of ramets. A ramet is a physiological unity that is not a replicator in and of itself. So frequently you'll have a bunch of copies of the same organism, like a clonal organism, or you'll see a whole bunch of tree trunks that all have the same genetic complement spread out over acres and acres. And there's live oak from South Carolina. And my favorite example there is germline chimerism in marmosets. Sorry, I'm just wondering if I have the right species there. Anyway, they frequently have non-identical twins, and in those non-identical twins, the twins will share material. They will share cells within the uterus of their mother. So they're going to be swapping tissue, and some of those tissues are germline tissues. And what this means is that you have child A and child B, and when those individuals have their own offspring, they can pass on the genes that are most common in their body, or they can pass on their twins' genes. They don't pass on their own genes because some of their germline material has been switched with their twin. So these marmosets represent two replicators and two regulators, but the boundaries of those two things don't line up. And this means that it's important to distinguish when we're talking about replicators, when we're talking about regulators. And if we use this word organism or individual, then we need to be clear what it is we're talking about. And of course, some of my favorite horror examples that perhaps the biologists know already. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis is a fungus that basically hijacks an ant's body. You have a spore that lands on the surface of the ant, and it sort of dissolves the shell and grows into the ant's brain. It will direct the ant to climb a tree and bite down on the central vein of a leaf. And then the ant's biology is going to continue keeping the ant alive for a little while the fungus grows out the back of the ant's head, produces a fruiting body, and because it's now high up on a plant, it can spread the next generation over a larger area. So that's a case where the ant regulator has been hijacked by either the regulator or the replicator of the fungus. And so its own genes aren't really doing the work of perpetuating themselves anymore, even though the ant genes are still doing the work of regulation. So that's a great example of one, but not the other. We also have the emerald cockroach wasp down there on the lower left, and they're going to inject a venom into a cockroach, and that venom basically stops the cockroach from either fleeing or fighting off the cockroach in any way. It also paralyzes the front legs, and the cockroach wasp leads the cockroach off to build a nest and plant eggs in it. The cockroach metabolism will continue so that the eggs have live food as soon as they hatch. Nice, horrible example from biology. So I'm interested, we've got this idea of Darwin life, and it's really popular to say that life is things that evolve, but what exactly does that mean? How do we turn this into a discrete hypothesis or a conceptual framework that can be tested? I'm going to claim that evolutionary definitions have been popular mostly because evolutionary theory has been successful in making predictions. And so I want to ask questions about the bounds of that success so that our evolutionary definition reflects not a vague sense of what evolution is, but a concrete methodology of evolutionary theory. There's a lot of history of evolutionary biology, people sort of wanting evolution to be either progressive or inherently competitive, or all of these sort of other things that go by the name of evolution, but don't really have this imprimatur of making successful predictions about the world. And so I'd like to sort of separate out my evolutionary definition of life as a scientific definition of life from an evolutionary definition of life that just is sort of the idea that, well, life struggles and gets better, because I don't think that's going to help us a whole lot. So, of course, we have to ask whose theory. And, of course, I want to distinguish between a compelling theory, which sounds really nice, and particularly an empirically successful theory. That's how I'm going to judge my success as a scientist, being someone who does a lot of theology and philosophy as well as science. Tend to distinguish my science as good science when it is doing particular work in making prediction about the world that we observe in similar ways. And so progressive evolution, I would say, is off the table. When I was looking for a good empirically successful theory, I figure population genetics is the best we have to go with. I know that's not one narrow theory, but it is a set of common assumptions about the way things work. And those of you who are pop gen people, I would be really interested in your input as to what aspects of population genetics should be considered sort of central or canonical, and maybe which other things are not. So I'm going to regard population genetics as the mathematical framework for understanding changes in population structure due to inheritance, variation, and selection of genes. And we have drift, migration, and linkage in there. I'm of the school of thought that says natural selection to some extent includes these things, but whether we call it natural selection or something else, those are the types of processes that I'm thinking of. Or we could say what has been usefully described using modern synthesis equations, not necessarily the conceptual structure of quote-unquote Darwinism or quote-unquote NeoDarwinism. I have been in debates about what those two terms mean, and frankly, it just doesn't seem worth my time. It's a lot of positioning about who gets to claim to be the authoritative representative. If by Darwinism we just mean evolution by natural selection, great. That's what the Oxford Dictionary means by it. But I avoid the term because a lot of people mean other things by Darwinism as well, particularly if they have an adaptationist perspective. And if you want to pin me down to something, the closest I would come to would be Darwinian Populations by Peter Godfrey Smith. I'm an academic, so of course I have caveats, things that I disagree with, but that's roughly the perspective that I'm taking. So what would be the consequences of an explicitly population genetic definition of life or definition of Darwin life? So it's okay if there's life that isn't this, but if we are going to define life or Darwin life in terms of evolution, I'm going to narrow it down and see what we can do with population genetics. Probably, if I was going for something, I would go on a focus on changes in allele frequency through time. It strikes me that it's this process of having a population in which there are alleles, and the frequency of those alleles is going to change really largely as a product of some inherited characteristic. So I want to shift from what is the definition of life that gets the most ink, that is Joyce's definition or the NASA definition, which unfortunately is not endorsed by NASA, but it has come in the literature to be called the NASA definition. What can I say? Anyway, the Joyce's definition is a system capable of Darwinian evolution. I somewhat object to that word capable because I don't know how we measure capability. I think we're very good at measuring actuality. So I would like to switch this to a system capable of being described using the equations of population genetics. This is somewhat along the lines of what Peter Godfrey Smith calls evolutionary nominalism. That is to say, these names we have for things, not necessarily something that exists in the world itself, not necessarily a natural category. I don't know whether the system is capable of Darwinian evolution, but I can talk about systems that are easily described as undergoing Darwinian evolution, and I think that's a useful tack. So, concrete consequences. I think we need a population explanatorily prior to individual replicators. What we have here is a system that's interacting. For a long time in origin of life studies, we've been looking for the first replicator, and I think that might be the wrong way to go. I think we might need to look for the first population of replicators. I think we need discrete genetic loci within the population. That is, if you're going to count population size, if you're somehow going to divvy out which quote-unquote individuals have a particular genotype, then you need to be able to count or at least divide the individuals. I'll get some disagreement with this from some folks, so I would certainly like input on that. And then I think we need defined, discrete, persistent alleles, and they could be genes or other heritable elements that affect traits and are not subject to blending inheritance, according to the Hardy-Weinberg principle. So you need something that somehow goes on through time and doesn't get sort of swamped out by this process of change and mixing. And of course, there might be multiple alleles at a single locus. And so this gives us a three-level picture of life. Classical individuals cannot live alone. Populations are key. Origin of life research should focus on the abiological formation of populations. And I would argue that additional levels may be added on top because the individuals are to some extent arbitrary. So these might be layers of loci as Dawkinsian vehicles, or they could be layers of alleles as in multi-level selection. There's different ways you can do this, but I don't think we need to privilege genes specifically as the only thing that gets passed on from generation to generation, partly because I'm not sure gene is very narrowly defined. Three more consequences: causes of variation as mechanisms for loci to change their allele. That is, you have to have some way to have mutation and for them to enter or leave the population. Selection, I'm going to argue, is the gain and loss of loci as a function of the allele. So this might be a slightly strange use of loci, but I'm really going for spots in the population. There's a certain amount of space to take up. And so if you lose your space because of your genes or your alleles, then I'm going to claim that that's going to be a type of selection. And then drift is the gain or loss of loci independent of the allele at that specific locus, because of course you can have environments and habitats get narrower, and that does not have to do with the alleles or the genes, it just has to do with the situation. And so fitness and function in this way are more explicitly linked to a relationship with a specific environment by the identification of allele frequency as the dependent variable. It is dependent upon the environment, and I'm doing this particularly because I want to maintain that tie to the environment, but also for philosophical reasons, because there's this question of whether genes have agency, and I think it makes much more sense to say that the environment and the process of natural selection has agency rather than the genes doing it. So I would like to sort of tie that in to the relationship between the environment and the alleles rather than really one or the other. There may be alternative, equally fruitful conceptions of evolution that could replace population genetics for defining Darwin life. Maybe we could do it with phylogenetics or game theory, but those are my knowledge of those leads me to believe that population genetics will be a more successful approach in coming up with something systematic, but I would love to hear suggestions about those other two or some other ones. Thank you. There's some papers that describe my work on related fields, and I'd really just like to get some feedback.